Instead of being in school right now, with finals approaching and all the cold weather upon us, raise your hand if you would rather be on a beach right now, this moment, relaxing. As I can see, many of us would, including myself. A perfect place that many people go to visit crystal clear water or embark on an adventure in the jungle is no other than Indonesia, which has been growing as a prime tourist destination in recent years.
In the early 1900s, foreign visitors weren't allowed into the country unless they had special permission from the leader at the time. This restricted many people from visiting the sites that Indonesia had to offer. Around the 1910s, Dutch families started building houses and starting families in Bali, which brought in more family members and foreign visitors. In the 40s, tourism started to pick up, and the Dutch colonizers started to notice that. They wanted to turn Bali into a luxury and exotic place, so they started advertising Bali as an exotic place to go with dreamy rice and tobacco fields and mystic temples. During the time of 1944 to 1963, the World War II didn't bring in many tourists, and Bali's tourism declined rapidly, just like every other place in the world. In the 70s, Bali had this stereotypical image that they were a hippie town. Many young tourists were traveling to Bali and staying at local families' houses and eating local food instead of staying at the big franchise hotels. At this time, clothing was also booming in popularity. For example, boho style clothing. In the 80s and 90s, the locals noticed that a lot of people were obsessed with Bali's culture and wondered why. As time went on, Bali's government started focusing more on tourism and even dedicated a certain amount of money just for tourism. They would use that money for attractions, to upkeep temples, and hold ceremonies. This sparked a lot of controversy among locals as they felt more money should be spent on proper healthcare and education instead of tourist attractions. This whole time, Bali has had a peaceful and nice image until 2002 hit. This is when Bali's 2002 bombings happened and it killed more than 200 people, and most of them were tourists. Many tourists started canceling their trips and bookings, causing many resorts to shut down due to lack of money. The government worked hard to recover, and finally their tourism industry recovered by 2011. Now when you travel to Bali, it's all you can ever dream of. Fancy hotels, calm clear water beaches, beautiful infrastructure, and perfect weather. Other places in Indonesia that are popular for tourism are Jakarta, Ubud, and Lombok. All have different elements to offer to the human eye.
White sand beaches, captivating culture, and breathtaking sights have made Indonesia a travel destination for many across the world. During COVID-19, many Indonesians speculated that the tourism industry could not possibly experience any more setbacks. As we all know, travel was inhibited for an extensive period of time during the pandemic, and many prime tourist destinations endured devastating impacts on their economies. For example, Houghton asserts that over 50% of Indonesia's economy is composed of profits from agriculture and tourism, both of which that were inhibited during this disastrous time. And on April 5th, 2021, Cyclone Saroha slammed Indonesia, the most powerful tropical storm to hit Indonesia, resulting in ferocious winds, flash flooding, and $400 million in extensive property damage, according to Professor Halifax. In relation to tourism, resorts were decimated, ports were submerged with water, livelihoods were lost, and unemployment was rampant for all because tourism took a significant decline. It is important to note that Western Australia also experienced Cyclone Saroha, but experts declared that the effects were minor in comparison to the suffering Indonesians because of their citizens' relative equivalent socioeconomic status. Unlike the Australians, Indonesians were struck with grief, as their only way to foster a living for not only themselves but their families was washed away in front of their very own eyes. Moreover, Cyclone Saroha exposed the geographic and social disparities of the Indonesian citizens employed in the tourism sector.
The path of Cyclone Saroha was quite unusual to experts. To illustrate, scientists observing the cyclone reported that cyclones resembling this intensity have only traveled this far south 26 times in the past 5,000 years. According to Stevens of NASA Earth Observatory, the storm's trajectory altered when the path of the storm encountered another tropical system, which launched the cyclone's trajectory to the west. Thus, the cyclone's severity was induced by warmer sea surface temperatures related to the La Nina conditions. La Nina is a weather pattern that occurs in the Pacific Ocean every few years. Under these circumstances, strong winds blow warm water at the ocean surface from South America to Indonesia, resulting in the elevation of water temperatures. When the heated water travels west, the cold water from the depths of the ocean rises to the surface close to the coast of South America. In brief, this phenomenon increases the prevalence of cyclones and was believed to escalate the effects of Cyclone Saraha. This could also be related to climate change effects. Around the world, climate change is expected to increase wind speed and rainfall, causing storms to be more severe in the years to come. More specifically, to the La Nina conditions, climate change will make the water warm already, and the La Nina conditions will only make it warmer, causing more severe storms to occur. And looking at this picture, during La Nina conditions, there is increased trade winds. This causes the heat to cover more of the Pacific Ocean, and this makes the water temperature warmer, and when cold and hot air mixes, it creates a storm. More storms occur during La Nina because cold and warm water and air are combining to make more severe storms.
Because of Cyclone Saraha, those who were employed in the tourism sector were marooned with loss to their property and their profession. Many of the citizens most affected happen to be individuals living in southern Indonesia and various tropical islands. Although the effects of this storm were widespread, one tourist-driven town of Kupang is an excellent example of the devastation and financial loss endured by the Indonesians. To illustrate, Kupang, a city that thrives on tourism, experienced immense destruction to the port of Kupang, various resorts, and infrastructure, according to Jasmine. Here's one section of the port of Kupang, looking very visually unattractive to the eye. It can be seen that there is a great amount of pollution in the water. These horrific sights and negative images of Indonesia ultimately deter tourists from coming to the area. Trash can be depicted predominantly in this disaster imagery, which requires extensive effort, which can be extremely difficult to achieve because those in the tourism industry are faced with a trade-off, their property or their job. Even before Saraha struck land, an abundance of visitors were still residing in various parts of Indonesia. Up until the very last minute, people were yearning to evacuate. Lambagdala asserts that over 100 tourists passed away on a ferry after the boat capsized due to dangerous weather because of Cyclone Saraha brewing. These negative images of Indonesian tourism can be directly connected to a loss in revenue, preventing locals from making a living. Additionally, most inhabitants of these highly tourist destinations are not very well off to recover from such drastic danger, forcing residents to start all over despite not having the economic ability to do so. The Guardian asserts that over 70% of homes were damaged where Saraha made landfall. Therefore, recovery of homes in the economy remains strenuous concerns for those reliant on tourism in Indonesia. Yeti Lakama, who resides in Kupang, asserted, "I didn't know what to do and where to go. Electricity cables, tin roofs, and trees lie on the street in front of our house." To have one's earnings dissipated in a matter of days is a wretched feeling. Because of the socioeconomic disparities, everyone is left to thrive for oneself, without any source of income. Those who lived in these tourist areas in the storm's trajectory were affected the most by the cyclone because there was no way for the victims to recover due to the pause put on the tourism industry.
So, Indonesia relies heavily on tourism. Their main source of income comes from tourist attractions. In 2020, the whole world was hit with COVID-19. a pandemic that restricted us from seeing other people, more specifically affecting the tourism sector around the world. Places like Hawaii, Japan, Malaysia, and many more places were hit heavily with COVID-19. I will be focusing on how COVID-19 affected the tourist industry in Indonesia. In 2020, foreign arrivals dropped by 75% from the previous year, going from 16.11 million in 2019 to 4.02 million in 2020. The tourist industry never saw this coming, and they weren't prepared. Indonesia's tourism economy supplies 5.7% of their country's gross domestic product. This provided over 12.6 million jobs in 2019. The Indonesian government needed tourism desperately, so they implemented high-end tourism. High-end tourism was targeted to people of higher class so that they would avoid mass tourism. With this approach, the people who were wealthier came into the country instead of a bunch of tourists. In theory, it reduced the environmental impacts, but increased economic benefits. This approach faced much backlash. For instance, in Jakarta, the locals were saying they don't agree with this approach, as everyone should have an equal chance to come into their country, instead of just the rich. Specific to Cyclone Saraha, the cyclone destroyed the country's pharmaceutical stockpile, holding most of the country's COVID-19 vaccines. Not only destroying their vaccines, but also destroying 2 of their COVID-19 isolation facilities. Indonesia's slow path to recovery wasn't helped by this cyclone. This only made matters worse, and Indonesia had to turn to other ways to restore their vaccines and create new isolation sites. It didn't help, too, that Indonesians' vaccination rates were relatively low. Unlike the United States and the United Kingdom, who rushed the vaccine rollout, Indonesia didn't, and their vaccination rate in 2021 was 6%. Indonesia also didn't have access to good vaccines like Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson vaccines. Most locals received the Sinovac vaccine, which is one of the least effective vaccines out there.
Overall, Cyclone Saraha highlights the geographic vulnerabilities of Indonesia associated with social vulnerabilities of the population working in the tourism sector. Because of the Saraha, the Indonesian government is forced to recognize how Indonesia, being dependent on tourism, requires the full addressment of the socio-economic disparities. For instance, Kurisari elaborates on how each cyclone generally increases with intensity, deterring tourists as previously mentioned, calling on the need for a formal development of a plan of action for economic relief of those affected by the unemployment associated with dangerous storms and Cyclone Saraha. Additionally, multiple reports have asserted that the Indonesian government does not have an adequate evacuation plan for tourists or their own residents in these dense cities. More broadly, this cyclone highlighted vulnerabilities in other countries experiencing the same inequalities as Indonesia, as Indonesia is not the only country facing this issue around the world. Therefore, Saraha contributed to the public realization that disparities must be addressed immediately due to the augmenting Sarahas to come. Thank you.